fans all over the world. Mat's coming from a startup now with the innovative spirit of electromobility to build fantastic hypercars, and Porsche as a strong financial partner.
For months, millions watched Mat Armstrong push Porsche to its limits. Rebuilding cars many believed were beyond saving. Then something extraordinary happened. Porsche's CEO finally responded, and the message wasn't what anyone predicted. It changed the conversation overnight, leaving fans wondering what really happened behind the scenes. The truth is far more surprising than the headlines have led people to believe. The answer Porsche finally gave him. For weeks, there was one question that hung over this entire build, and it refused to go away. Mat Armstrong had bought a broken Porsche GT3 RS from 2016 for £87,000 at a repossession auction, a car that still looked immaculate on the outside but would not run at all. The previous owner had taken it into Porsche with an engine problem while it still carried a full manufacturer warranty, and instead of repairing it, Porsche had torn that warranty up and handed the car back broken. Nobody could work out why a company would walk away from one of its own flagship cars like that. The answer came from the last place he expected it. Deep into the rebuild, Mat picked up the phone to order the parts he needed, and it was during that ordinary phone call that Porsche finally broke their silence and told him the real reason. What they said stopped everyone in the workshop cold, because it had almost nothing to do with a broken engine. They explained that when the car had first come in, the wear inside the engine did not match the mileage showing on the clocks. When their technicians connected their computer, the data told a story that made no sense on the surface. In the previous year alone, the engine had run for around 30 hours, and yet across every one of those hours, the car had only traveled at roughly 1.4 miles an hour. An engine simply does not spin for 30 hours while the car crawls along at walking pace unless somebody has been hiding how far it has really gone. Porsche suspected that a mileage blocker had been fitted somewhere in the car's history, and the moment they suspected the odometer had been touched, they refused to stand behind the car at all. That is a brutal thing to land on a new owner. The problem was never simply that the engine had failed. The problem was that Porsche believed the car had been tampered with, and they were not willing to pour a warranty repair into a vehicle they no longer trusted. If you have ever been handed the blame for something another person quietly broke and walked away from, then you already understand the weight that settled over Mat the day he heard those words. What makes this so much bigger than one Porsche is what came next. This was not the first time one of the giants of the car world had been forced to answer to a self-taught man working out of a small unit in England, and it would turn out not to be the last. Within the same year, an even more powerful name in the industry would break its own silence and speak directly to Mat. And when that happened, the entire car world stopped and stared. The chief executive who could not stay quiet. Around the start of 2026, something happened that had never really happened before in the way it did here. Mat Armstrong, the man who runs Bugatti, one of the rarest and most expensive car makers on the planet, recorded a message aimed at Mat Armstrong. Chief executives of hypercar brands do not usually acknowledge that outside repairs even exist. Yet, there he was, addressing one YouTuber directly, because a rebuild in a workshop had grown so loud that a company of that size could no longer pretend not to hear it. The situation that dragged him into it was another impossible project. Mat had taken on a crashed Bugatti Chiron that the factory had quoted an enormous sum to repair, and Bugatti had refused to sell the parts needed to do it privately. The internet had run wild with stories about the eye-watering cost of Bugatti ownership, and eventually the pressure grew heavy enough that the boss himself felt he had to answer. When Rimac spoke, he tried to steady the story. He said that most of what people were hearing about Bugatti service and repair costs simply was not true, and he pushed back hard on the wildest figures circulating online. He even offered to bring the car back to the factory in France so it could be repaired properly. What he could not take back was the far bigger thing that had already landed in the minds of millions of viewers, which was that the head of Bugatti had felt the need to respond to one man with a set of tools. Mat could barely believe it was real. He said openly that it was mental that the boss of Bugatti was not only watching his videos, but had gone to the effort of making a reply to them. Later, he described the whole thing like a respectful rivalry between two well-known names who quietly admire each other from a distance, the sort of tension the internet loves to stretch far beyond what it really is. He made it clear he did not want to fight with anybody. He only ever wanted to prove that these cars could be saved. That is the thread that ties this whole story together, the angle most people miss when they only watch a single video. One after another, the biggest names in the business have found themselves reacting to this one man. Porsche were forced to explain themselves over a phone call. Bugatti were pulled in by their own chief executive. Ferrari would later get dragged into the same kind of standoff over a car of theirs he refused to give up on. To understand why these companies now watch him so closely, you have to go right back to that silent Porsche sitting on his ramp, and the gamble that most people told him was a terrible idea. The clues the last mechanic left behind. On paper, this car looked like the bargain of a lifetime. The paintwork was wrapped in protective film, the interior had been cared for beautifully, and almost everything on it was original. A GT3 RS in that kind of condition should command a small fortune, so the low price was not a gift. It was a warning. A price that good on a car this special almost always means something underneath is seriously wrong, and Mat knew it when he handed over his money. The first job was to lift the car onto the ramp and search for anything obvious, and straight away, the engine began telling on whoever had been inside it before. There was oil pooling on the floor, and when Mat put his hand on the sump plugs, both of them were only finger-tight. Two loose sump plugs do not happen by chance. Somebody had drained this engine, or opened it up, and never done the job back up properly. And that was the very first sign that this car carried a hidden history that nobody had bothered to write down. Then came the smaller details, and they were the ones that made the skin crawl. One of the lower suspension arm bolts was missing its nut and its thread entirely, which is not something that comes loose on its own. Clips had vanished from the intake pipe. Hoses had been left hanging, unconnected. It genuinely looked as though the car had been ripped apart in a hurry and thrown back together by someone who never expected it to run again. Every panel that came off gave up another quiet piece of evidence. The strangest clue of all had been sitting in plain sight since the day the car arrived. Resting loose on the passenger seat was a single fuse. Mat had barely given it a second glance when he first collected the car. Now, deep into the rebuild, he went hunting for where it belonged, and he found an empty slot in the fuse box marked B5, which turned out to be a 20-amp fuel pump relay. With that fuse pulled out, the car could crank forever and never receive a single drop of fuel. And that was exactly why it would not start. When Mat finally pushed the fuse home and cranked it, the engine roared into life and immediately reeked of raw fuel, and the engine light began to flash, which meant it was misfiring badly. The entire right-hand side of the engine, cylinders 4, 5, and 6, was completely dead. The fuse had solved the no start, but half of this engine had gone silent for a reason nobody had found yet. The flaw that Porsche built into the engine. To find out why one whole bank of the engine had fallen silent, Mat stripped it back methodically. He pulled the wheels, removed the spark plugs, and finally lifted the rocker cover on the side that would not fire. What he uncovered was not accident damage, and it was not simple neglect. It was something far more uncomfortable, because the fault pointed straight back at Porsche themselves. Inside these engines sit tiny parts called finger followers. Each one rides between the camshaft and the valve, and every time the engine turns, the cam pushes on the follower, and the follower opens the valve so the engine can breathe. On this exact generation of GT3 RS, those finger followers and the camshafts that run against them are known to wear out early. This is not some obscure rumor. Owners have discussed it for years, and it comes down to the material Porsche chose for these parts. The metal was simply not hard enough, and over thousands of miles it wears the surfaces flat. When Mat lifted out the intake camshaft and studied it under the light, the evidence was impossible to argue with. The lobes that are supposed to be perfectly smooth and rounded had worn flat in places. A cam that has gone flat can no longer open its valve fully or smoothly, and an engine cannot breathe through a valve that will not open all the way. It might tick over. It might even sound fine for a few seconds. The instant you ask it to rev, though, it starts to misfire because it is being starved of air at exactly the moment it needs the most. So, a fault that Porsche had effectively built into the car, a warranty voided because Porsche suspected the mileage had been hidden, and both of those things landing on the same broken engine. Mat fitted brand new camshafts and new finger followers to both sides, timed everything up with real care, and lowered the engine back into the car, fully expecting the misfire to be gone. He turned the key, and the same 3 cylinders on the right-hand side lit up the dashboard exactly as before. And in that moment, the whole team realized that something else, something they had not even considered yet, was still wrong. The late-night mistake that cracked the case. This is the stage of the build that almost broke him completely. The engine came out for a second time. He checked the timing again, and it was spot on. He swapped parts across. He tested the spark. He ran a compression test. And everything he looked at insisted the engine should be running clean. Yet the diagnostic tool kept dragging him back to the same bizarre reading. On the right-hand side, the timing was trying to move itself by more than 22 degrees. When on these engines, it should never shift by more than about 6. The engine was fighting against itself, and no obvious cause could be found anywhere. He called Porsche again and was told the car might just need a special electronic reset once it was all built back up. So he built it up, he took the engine in and out yet again, and still the misfire returned on cylinders 4, 5, and 6 the second he revved it. By this point, most people would have thrown in the towel and blamed the engine itself. Mat had already canceled a flight to Miami to keep chipping away at it. And both his patience and his ideas were running dangerously thin. Then, late one night, he sat down and watched back every second of his own footage, searching for anything he might have overlooked. And that is where he found it. On the end of each camshaft sits a component called a variator, the part responsible for that variable timing. On the left side of the engine, the thicker variator sat on the intake cam, and the thinner one sat on the exhaust. On the right side, the side that flatly refused to run, the two were fitted the wrong way round. The reason that detail is so chilling is that Mat had never touched those variators himself. He had pulled the camshafts out and left the variators sitting exactly where they were, trusting that they had been fitted correctly the last time the engine was assembled. Then, the truth clicked into place. Porsche had taken this engine apart during that original repair, worked out what was wrong, and once they decided not to honor the warranty, they had simply thrown the whole lot back together to return it to the customer. They had no reason to care which way the variators went, because in their eyes, this car was never going to run again. That one wrong assumption had cost him 2 extra engine removals and days of his life. He swapped the variators onto the correct sides, timed everything up one final time, and dropped the engine in for what he swore would be the very last occasion. This time, it fired up, it idled smoothly, it revved cleanly, and not one warning light remained on the dash. The car Porsche had given up on was finally alive again, and now Mat had to face the one thing that unsettled him more than any misfire ever had, which was driving it straight back to Porsche and letting them sit in judgment over his work. Back in front of Porsche. Even the drive to Porsche turned into one last cruel test. On the way there, A coolant pipe that had been disconnected during the rebuild popped off. The temperature gauge climbed alarmingly, and steam began pouring from the back of the car. It had to be trailered home so the hose could be pushed back on and the cooling system filled properly. After everything he had already survived, this GT3 RS very nearly beat him on the last stretch of tarmac, and it hammered home the lesson that the smallest loose clip can quietly undo hours of the most careful work. When the car finally made it inside the Porsche Center, it was put through what they call a 111-point inspection. This is the deep examination a technician carries out before Porsche will place its own approved warranty back onto a car. If it passed, Mat would own a fully covered GT3 RS, which for a car pulled from a repossession auction is almost unheard of. The results came back far kinder than he had feared. There was a little play in a front wheel bearing, the brake pads were rusted and needed replacing, and the roll cage rattled because whoever had removed it last had put the bolts back the wrong way round. Every one of those faults was small, and every one was fixable. The warranty itself did not appear on the day, and there was a clear reason for the delay. To claim it, an owner has to keep the car for more than 90 days, a rule Porsche uses to stop traders from buying a wreck, rushing it through, grabbing the warranty, and flipping it for a quick profit. So Mat had to wait it out. The old mileage suspicion still sat quietly in the background, but because he was now a fresh owner with a fully repaired car, the people at Porsche were genuinely hopeful they could argue that the earlier concern had nothing to do with him, and that the flag against the car could eventually be lifted. Look at the raw numbers, and the gamble suddenly makes complete sense. He paid £87,000 for the car and spent only around £5,500 on the parts to bring it back from the dead. A clean GT3 RS of this age and mileage sits somewhere around £135,000 to £140,000. Even after all the labor, all the sleepless nights, and an engine that came out more times than he ever wants to count again, the maths falls firmly and comfortably in his favor. Porsche did respond to Mat Armstrong, just not in the polished way anybody expects when they think of a car giant speaking out. They did not release a careful statement or record a friendly video the way the boss of Bugatti later would. They let the truth slip out over an ordinary phone call about spare parts. And that accidental honesty revealed more about how these companies treat the machines they build than any press release ever could. One self-taught man in a small unit had quietly pulled the truth out of a company that had every reason to keep it buried. And right now, the rest of the industry is watching very carefully to see whose door he knocks on next. So now, tell me in the comments whether you believe Porsche were right to walk away from this car, or whether they hid behind a mileage suspicion to dodge a repair they should have covered all along.